Excuse me, everybody. Hello, excuse me.
We have to publish
Excuse me.
English, French, Portuguese.
We take 5 minutes because downstairs the plenary is not finished yet. So we'll start in 5 minutes. Thank you.
Son un poco lentejas, ¿no?
All right, everyone, we'll start. I'm aware that downstairs still hasn't finished and we may have more people coming into the room, but I think we must keep going because there's also another session after us. So first of all, let me just say welcome. Thank you very much for coming to our session in the Finance and Common. We think we've got a very exciting spread for you, exciting discussion, and hope you enjoy it. Our speakers have been given 3 minutes to speak, and I've even got a little bell if we go too much over time. So first of all, I think we need to appreciate that from the speaker's perspective, it's actually very difficult to encapsulate everything they want to say with the passion in 3 minutes, but we're doing our best, and we will have a round of questions after as well. So hopefully we can get some more air into the discussion. Let me just say that our topic about public banks and public policies, UNCTAD, very happy to host this, also with SOAS and McMaster University. UNCTAD, part of the United Nations that focuses on trade, divestment, finance and development. And we've long had an interest in public banks. Through the times when they were deeply unfashionable and criticized, UNCTAD was also supporting public banks, not all public banks, not blindly, of course, but the ideal of a public bank. We have always felt this was very important. And now, certainly in the last few years, there's really a reappraisal of the role of public banks. And we are being asked increasingly by our member states to help them understand better how they can use their public banks and how they can support them and how they can avoid some of the problems of the past, but benefit from all that public banks can offer. So I'm really excited that we're having this discussion today. Our opening speaker, Jose Antonio Ocampo, is visiting us from New York. Unfortunately, he's not able to be present with us physically. He was formerly UN Undersecretary General for DESA, Economic and Social Affairs, but also deeply involved in politics here in Colombia, as well as the Minister of Finance and Public Credit for Colombia, and also on the Central Bank and Development Bank. So he's a deep experience, and I'm hoping he's here with us. Jose Antonio, are you there? Super.
Aquí estoy.
Okay,
Yes, I'm here.
over to you.
Muchas gracias por estar con todos ustedes. Me encantaría estar allá en Cartagena en vez de acá en Nueva York, precisamente en este foro. Ya esta mañana hubo una presentación sobre los bancos de desarrollo de Colombia. Yo quiero recordar que Colombia tiene una red de 4 bancos de desarrollo. Bancoldes, que es uno de los organizadores de este evento, que trabaja sobre desarrollo industrial y comercio. Digamos, fue históricamente encargado de todo lo que es la política de diversificación de exportaciones de Colombia. Finagro, que es el banco para el sector agropecuario. Findeter, que es para desarrollo territorial, sobre todo para apoyar las empresas, bueno, los proyectos de los departamentos y municipios de Colombia en diferentes campos, y la Financiera de Desarrollo Nacional, que es un banco de infraestructura. Estos bancos son fundamentalmente públicos, pero algunos tienen algunas inversiones privadas o multinacionales, como el caso de la Financiera de Desarrollo Nacional. Este sistema tuvo una contracción importante en la primera década de este siglo, pero desde entonces se ha estabilizado y además cumplió un papel contracíclico interesante durante la pandemia del COVID-19 y lo está cumpliendo todavía ahora. Debo decir que este grupo de bancos, al igual que nuestro único banco de primer piso, que es el Banco Agrario, las diferentes fondos de garantías que tenemos son 2 fondos de garantías y otras instituciones financieras del sector público, pertenece a lo que en Colombia se llama el Grupo Bicentenario. Este grupo, que es coordinado por el Ministerio de Hacienda, fue objeto de una política especial que yo tuve la oportunidad de lanzar como ministro de Hacienda. Esa política básicamente señaló que había 3 objetivos para esa red de instituciones. El primero es la inclusión financiera. Y en esa materia lanzamos la iniciativa de tener 1 millón de pequeñas, de microempresas y pequeñas empresas que tengan acceso a crédito formal durante el cuatrenio del gobierno actual. Y eso se hace a través de los bancos de desarrollo, del Banco Agrario también, pero también de los fondos de garantías, que cumplen un papel muy importante en la materia. Y además tuvimos una novedad en términos de costo, que fue establecer una reducción de deuda para aquellos que paguen la deuda. Porque un tema muy importante en la inclusión financiera es que los microempresarios sean reconocidos como buenos clientes para que sigan teniendo crédito hacia adelante. El segundo es la función de innovación, de fomento a la innovación, en lo cual Bancoldes es la institución fundamental en el caso colombiano. Y aquí, digamos, aparte de los temas de crédito, hay la posibilidad de capital de riesgo, de venture capital, que Bancoldes es la institución que más ha venido desarrollando ese sistema y, digamos, puede ayudar, por lo tanto, a promover pequeñas empresas innovadoras. Y la tercera es la economía verde, donde en el caso colombiano hay varios temas, obviamente en el caso de mitigación del cambio climático y por lo tanto la innovación hacia nuevas empresas energéticas, pero también muy importante en el caso colombiano, frenar la deforestación, que es nuestro principal problema en materia climática. Y aparte de los temas climáticos, y con eso termino, en Colombia es muy importante la promoción de la biodiversidad y por lo tanto los proyectos que impulsen la biodiversidad, ya que somos uno de los países, somos de hecho el segundo país megadiverso del mundo. Muchas gracias.
Thank you. That was wonderful, Jose Antonio. Very interesting to hear the 4 different public banks, each with a different function and purpose and some different degrees of publicness. Thank you very much. I'm turning now to our next speaker, Thomas Marowatz, a professor of political economy at McMaster's University and a longtime advocate and writer on public banks. Thomas.
Thank you very much, Diana. The purpose of my intervention is to give a little context to why we're here today and the thoughts behind our panel and why we formed this at the FIX, and to pitch it at a slightly broader level to help us think and rethink the role of public banks today. And I want to do that by posing a few questions that I want us to think about as a panel collectively and as guests in this room about the future of public banks. And for first and foremost, one of those questions is, for whom do public banks function and why? For whom do they function? How do we know if the programs being delivered are in the public interest, are in fact in the public interest? Who defines the public purposes of public banks? Who benefits? These are some of the questions that really motivated Diana and I and Uli in thinking about this panel, motivates my work, motivates the work that we do together in the wider world and when we work with public banks. I won't elaborate on what I see to be some of my answers. I want to leave that to this panel and to this room. But let me say, though, as a brief keynote message, that there is nothing natural or neutral about public banks. These are contested institutions in society, in the world, among different public banks, and that the public banks that we see in this room and around us are only as good as our societies make them to be, or as bad. There are good, there are bad public banks, and it's up to us as intelligent, thoughtful citizens of this world and society to make them better, to tackle these challenges of sustainable development goals, and to give them the purpose of green and just transitions. So we want to have an open debate about this, about their public purposes, the nature of their public policies, and this is really no more needed than now as we are tasking the world's massive, powerful, and competent public banks to deliver on the future of our society. Thank you.
Thank you, Thomas. Moving to our, well, that was a very good framing of what we need to think about. I think especially this phrase that it's not automatic. There's nothing natural about a public bank. We in this room can have a voice in how it should be, what it should be directed at, and how it has the instruments and the capitalization and the mandate to do those things. So very interested to turn to our next speaker, Johannes Boomer, who is going to speak to us now from the Council of European Development Bank. And this is one of a very interesting bank for us to have here today, but it's an explicit and unique function, a unique social mandate for many banks. So Johannes, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Diana, and thank you very much for having me, for having us as the Council of Europe Development Bank, a multilateral bank, exclusively working in its member states, 43 member states. Think of Europe geographically, so it's larger than the European Union, as we are a bit the financing arm of the Council of Europe, which is, again, larger than the European Union. Our shareholders, you mentioned development banks are as good as societies allow them to be. I would put a little less pressure on the societies, but I would specify as our shareholders allow us to be. So there is, of course, that big responsibility in shareholders to constantly challenge us against our mandate. And our mandate at the Council of Europe Development Bank is exclusively social. Everything we do, each project that we finance, normally with classical loans, it has to be social. And still, when also linking now this to the climate topic, our leitmotif at the CEB is that the climate change crisis is also a social crisis that can impact social cohesion and undermine the SDGs. Likewise, social action and climate action go hand in hand and can be mutually reinforcing. We've seen this throughout Europe, where vulnerable populations such as the elderly, low-income individuals and those with pre-existing health conditions bear the brunt of more frequent and intense weather conditions, from heat waves to droughts, to floods, to forest fires. The result is more hardship, more social inequality, and higher risk of social exclusion and migration. At the CEB, we put such vulnerable groups at the center of our efforts to address climate change. We call this the social climate nexus. So what does it mean in practice? It means supporting investments that are low carbon and at the same time bring significant social benefits to the most vulnerable. As an example, CEB finances energy efficiency improvements in the social housing sector that not only provide people with decent, affordable housing, but reduces energy poverty and emissions of greenhouse gases at the same time. As a country example, in Georgia, southeast of Europe, the CEB has financed a school renovation program which includes structural improvements as well as extensive energy efficiency measures so as to provide a basic level of comfort for students and teachers. Climate resilience, resilient development, supporting climate adaptation is also central to our social mandate, as climate-related hazards may have significant social impacts, particularly on vulnerable populations. Financing flood protection measures is a good example. CEB has financed flood protection measures for decades, including in Greece in most recent years. We are also active in supporting our member states, in, for instance, Turkey last year, in building local defenses and strengthening readiness against wildfires. In summary, we can see the interlinkage between climate action and social inclusion as crucial for CEB. We can fulfill our mission of promoting social cohesion and inclusive growth while contributing to achieving the SDGs and addressing the urgent challenges of climate change. The just dimension is more than just providing a safety net, but it's about engaging with communities on the ground and creating opportunities for all. Delivering on the just transition requires a combined effort. At the CEB, we believe all transition investments should put social considerations front and center. Just finally, as a link to the Financing Common platform, we believe it is instrumental to help chart the right course of action and foster the increased and more efficient cooperation among several stakeholders. And under the umbrella of FIX, the Coalition of Social Investment, which the CEB leads together with the Agence Française de Développement, brings together public development banks with a social vocation. The coalition strives to maintain social investment at the forefront of its members' policy agenda and operations, advocate for more resilient social infrastructure, and channel more funding towards social investment. Thank you for now.
Thank you very much. An interesting description and the way that you show how the investment, the lending is driven first by the social mandate, but it's still lending, it's still an investment. I think that's a very important point that you made there. Thank you. Let me turn now to Agnes Babugura from the South African Adaptation Network. Agnes, I know you've done a lot of work on gender equality and public banks and the way that public banks can foster gender equality. Perhaps you could share that with us. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for this opportunity to be here and for being invited to participate in this event. Generally, gender equality as we know it, it is a fundamental aspect of a just transition, and it's a core component of the social justice and inclusivity. Now, gender equality is increasingly being integrated into the views and public purposes of the public development banks. And this has happened as a matter of public purpose because promoting gender equality in a just transition aligns with the broader public purpose of the public development banks. And this happens in several ways. Sorry, let me just get closer. So this happens in several ways. First and foremost, if we look at the context of social inclusion, public development banks exist to support the well-being and equitable development of society. And by advancing gender equality, they basically ensure the benefits of a just transition, that the just transition are accessible to all, and leaving no one behind. So that is part of their purpose. And if we look at the context of sustainable development, gender equality is a key component to sustainable development, and public development banks contribute to sustainable economic growth and environmental protection. And gender equality is essential for achieving these goals in an inclusive and equitable manner. If we look in the context of social cohesion, promoting gender equality fosters social cohesion and reduces inequalities, which are important elements of the public purpose. So basically, in a just transition that leaves no one behind, contributes to a more and harmonious and stable society. If we look at the context of global commitments, many countries have international commitments to gender equality. And what we find is that by fulfilling their commitments to gender equality, public development banks are basically helping these countries to meet their global obligations. So in general, we can say that public development banks have a responsibility to fulfill their commitment to gender equality as part of their broader public purpose to promote equitable, sustainable, and inclusive development. So gender equality is not only a matter of social justice, but it's also a critical component to achieve the societal and environmental goals that public developments are tasked with in advancing. So I think I can leave it here for now, and I can elaborate a bit more when I give my final thoughts, just to keep time. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Our next speaker is Ivan Oliveira, the Deputy Secretary for Sustainable Development in the Ministry of Finance of Brazil. Ivan, if we can ask you, how did your role in your ministry envisage collaborating with public banks or working with public banks? What is your relationship with that in terms of policy making or lending requests or requirements?
Thank you, Diana. It's a pleasure to be here with you all. So many references. I had my life like Ocampo. Tony used to be my professor, in fact. Yes, I just like to bring to you something that we're doing at the Ministry of Finance of Brazil, and is well connected to this agenda of just transition and the role of public banks. Right now, we're dealing with what we're calling ecological transition plan, or transformation plan, in fact, where we're thinking about transition transformation. But anyway, it should generate the transformation that we need in Brazil with 6 axes. One has to do with energy transition, another one with bioeconomy, a third one with green infrastructure, a fourth one on circular economy, and the fifth on technological transformation. And there's this across-the-board one that is really important and connects to this panel, that is the sustainable finance one, where we're dealing with creating new mechanisms and regulations that should help finance this structural transformation in Brazil. We're talking about building our sustainable taxonomy, building our domestic carbon market. Our green bonds are about to be launched very soon by the Treasury. And all that is really connected to some other plans that we have in Brazil, like the Infrastructure Accelerating Plan, the PAC, that has just been launched, where the public banks are just essential. So it is pretty much BNDES, Banco do Brasil, Caixa, and Banco do Nordeste, a subnational development bank, that are really leading the agenda when it comes to infrastructure transformation in the country. And there is a key role to be played by the multilateral development banks there. And that's something we're right now dealing with at the International Department of the Ministry. There is this idea of creating a Brazilian strategy towards the multilateral development banks, where we bring the banks to where the money is lacking, and so somehow using strategically the money that we have, not just on a first come, first serve, or in a competition among the banks in order to get good projects in Brazil. So in that sense, a pleasure to be with you and to bring to you this agenda we're pushing forward in Brazil from the Minister of Finance. That's something also interesting to hear. That is not quite often that we see the Minister of Finance leading a green agenda in the country. I think there's a lot we have to learn from other Latin American countries, and Brazil is keen to push that and also connect that agenda when it comes to the MDBs, for example, in our G20 presidency in the IFA working group or in the Sustainable Finance working group, where we do see a key role for public money to really de-risk and push private capital into sustainable projects. We cannot think about the trillions without thinking about the kind of blend we're going to need from public money, from treasuries, including the green funds, that we have plenty of money there not being used, or essentially financing the UST bonds, to generate impact. So thank you. My time is up. I'll be back soon. Thank you.
Thank you. You will indeed be back. We will have discussion from the audience, and then you get another question. I think it's a very interesting point you raised, this interrelationship between the ministry and the bank. You're describing a relationship, a discussion, a kind of a coordination. And you've also hit on this question of the coordination between many banks, which is something that another speaker will be picking up on. Then this question about plenty of money not being used. Well, that's the big question. Whether, what are the ways to get that? Let us move to our next speaker, which is, I believe, Stephanie. Are you here, Stephanie? Stephanie, very kindly joining us, taking time out from the. In fact, I believe that the Central Bank of Chile will be setting interest rates as soon as you have finished our discussion, Stephanie. Thank you very much for making time to us. Over to you.
Estoy encantada de estar con ustedes, aunque me gustaría estar presencialmente, pero por lo menos es un gran gusto estar en este panel. I think I will talk in English because I see that most of the audience, I think, is English speaking. I want to refer to the kind of instruments which development banks can use so as to achieve maximum development impact, sustainable and inclusive development impact, and how they can, in the best way, leverage private finance. And I think that there are different mechanisms through which this can be done, both that maximize this development impact and minimize contingency risk of liabilities. I think the first instrument is that development banks can borrow on capital markets, either national or international. And of course, international capital markets are deeper, but if development banks borrow in foreign currency, they can have a problem of mismatched currencies when they lend to companies that produce goods and services for the domestic market. So if they can fund themselves in the domestic capital market, and it is deep enough, this is a very good policy. The second mechanism is that development banks can co-finance with private lenders or private investors. And the third mechanism is that they can channel funds through commercial banks, which is called préstamo de segundo piso in Spanish, and it's called on lending in English. And the advantage of these three mechanisms is, particularly the first two, is that they can keep policy steer so as to maximize development impact. So the priorities of this lending is linked to development plans that have been agreed by the government and the private sector. whilst at the same time increasing leverage of private resources. Of course, it's not just about lending, but it's about direct equity, guarantees, venture capital, and other mechanisms. But I think what is interesting to stress is that countries can get a greater policy impact, a policy steer, when using complex instruments, especially these are opaque, and where the development impact may be much more difficult to assess. And also where there is a risk of creating contingent liabilities. So the temptation of using financial engineering, if not done very carefully, which is actually understandable because governments are trying to do more with less, especially if they have such a big challenge like the green transition or lending in a counter-cyclical way during and after a crisis. These financial engineering must be done in careful ways so that one can safeguard the impact that the development bank lending will have on inclusive and sustainable development, and so that no contingent liabilities are generated, which may be expensive in the future. And so perhaps one should think not just about financial engineering, but more about the issue of increasing capital of development banks, both national, regional, and multilateral. And I think in this case, the case for increasing the capital of multilateral development banks, as was done after the 2007-2008 financial crisis, the subprime crisis, should have happened, and it is unfortunate it hasn't happened. And I think it needs to be encouraged so that they can play a bigger role. As we wrote in a paper with Diana, for example, mobilizing SDRs that developed countries have and don't use could be a useful mechanism to increase the capital of development banks. And finally, if I can, I would like to just give very briefly some examples of contributions that development banks made to the green transition. I think a very clear one is the funding, for example, of solar energy, which started in many ways in Germany through the mechanism of the KfW, the German Development Bank, which pioneered lending in this sector, almost alone, then catalyzed private finance and was very successful. But then the initiative was taken by the Chinese, and also playing a big role was the Chinese Development Bank. And in this way, solar panels have been produced, which are actually extremely cheap. And this is not just a public good for Germany and China, but actually a global one, because it implied that solar energy can now be supplied in a competitive way with fossil fuels. And I think this is a big achievement which these countries have had, but which are also in an important extent due to the role that the development banks can play. And I think the future challenges in the new sources of green energy, what we have, for example, in our Latin American region, we have a lot of lithium and hydrogen, particularly I'm thinking here of Chile, but also other neighboring countries. Again, I think development banks will be called to play an important role together with the private sector to generate investment in a major way to support the so crucial green transition. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Stephanie. Thank you. So Stephanie, I think, brought out for us very well this link between the purpose and the instruments that the bank has to fulfill that purpose, and then the question of the capitalization. Does it have the financial space to use those instruments and to fulfill its purpose? And certainly the paper that she's referring to, where we interviewed a very large number of public banks, it was made all the difference to how much capitalization banks were able to release, particularly for countercyclical lending in the COVID period. And there's a very clear trend where some banks were able to increase their lending by 200, 300, even 400%, and others could not and had to leave entire sectors of the economy unsupported. So a very important point. That leads us to our next speaker at the KfW, David Denza Speck, who looking forward to hearing from you, David, about the, as you said, the response of KfW has been dominated by the crisis response in recent years, but you're hoping to be able to look forward and to a broad, longer-term horizon now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Diana, and thank you for inviting me to the panel. KfW is the promotional bank of Germany. We have birthday this year. We just become 75 years old. Yeah. As you might know, we were set up in 1948 after World War II, and the Marshall Fund money provided by the United States was not used as grant, but we implemented the means by loans, and that was the origin of KfW. So today, what are we and what are we not? We heard before in the introduction that in Colombia we have 4 institutions. KfW is a group, so we have a collection of different institutions. We have a development bank, we have a commercial project and export financing arm, we have a venture capital arm in Germany, and domestic operations. So we have a whole bunch of different instruments under our disposal. And coming to CEB, which is a very focused institution on social aspects, KfW is very much a multi-purpose institution. And Thomas, you asked, okay, what do development or public banks do? In our case, that is stipulated by the law. So we have a multi-layer system. We have a basic law on KfW, which defines where we can be active and where we cannot be active, and a little bit defines our privileges, but also our responsibilities. And then we have different sector guidelines. We have annual negotiations with the government. So there's a whole layer of different rules and procedures, which in the end define what we can do. Diana, you mentioned the crisis, and we had a really extraordinary year last year in terms of volume. Normally, our business volume is around 80 billion per year. Last year, it was 170 billion, which was the largest ever year. Of course, that was partly due to COVID and partly to the war in Ukraine. Yeah. And I think 2 elements that I want to share is we were able to do that, of course, due to the support of the German government. So you need, in our case, a guarantee on the capital markets to be able to do that. You need maybe grants. And we were not able to do that alone. So in the end, I always say we are a bridge. Yeah. So it's all depending on your relation with the government, but also on your relation with the commercial banks and the private sector. If that works well, you can react. And also within our mandate, it's totally doable to be crisis manager, but we want to be transformation manager. So we hope we get out of the crisis mode and can take a little bit more longer perspective. I'm coming to an end, and maybe one wish to the scientific side. Please do look at implementation. Yeah, so we have a lot of data collection, which is always nice, but if you have the chance, look at a loan contract. Yeah, I would say we often have with policymakers, we have a lot of discussion about conflict between different targets, and unless you go really in the boring stuff of the implementation, you never really go to the core of the issue. So, as one wish, if you have the chance, really go a little bit in the direction of implementation, and then I think it's really beneficial for us to get even more advice from the scientific side. Thank you very much.
Thank you, thank you. That's very interesting, because you're picking up on the point that Stephanie also made about with some of the financial instruments being very opaque. You don't know what's in them. whether you're being opened to contingent liabilities and concerns quite apart from the other issue of are you having that positive impact that you want. So thank you, that was very interesting. And also I picked up on it all depends on the relationship with government. I think that's a very important point that you've made there. Look forward to having some discussion about that. Okay, that takes us to our next speaker. Thank you very much. Rodolfo. Rodolfo is from Latindad, so possibly well known to the Latin Americans in the room. Rodolfo, you're representing civil society, so it'd be very interesting for us to hear what are the concerns of civil society with regard to public banks, and what is the role of public banks for civil society's needs. Thank you.
Thanks, Diana. Muchas gracias por la invitación y la oportunidad de estar acá. Lo primero que tendría que decir es que nos hubiera gustado como sociedad civil haber estado presentes en la ceremonia, en la apertura, a pesar que se ofreció el espacio, finalmente no se dio. Bueno, pensamos que la inclusión tiene que ser en todo nivel, ¿no? Bueno, algunas preocupaciones que tenemos no solo como Latindad, sino como sociedad civil que hacemos seguimiento a todos estos procesos vinculados al financiamiento y al desarrollo y al clima, desde los proyectos locales hasta las reformas que se deben de dar a nivel internacional, son muchas. Bueno, voy a comentar en el tiempo que tengo las que pueda, pero primero mencionar, bueno, que nuestros países, sobre todo los países en desarrollo, somos altamente vulnerables, ¿no? Incluyendo los de ingresos medios, vulnerables en todo sentido, socialmente, económicamente, climáticamente. La pandemia, la guerra nos ha dejado una situación bastante precoz, precaria, bastante, además, económicamente y financieramente endeudados, ¿no? Y con una deuda que tenemos que seguir pagando, va a ser más difícil poder atender las necesidades financieras que tenemos que aseguren de que vamos a lograr por lo menos encaminarnos hacia lo que queremos, que es un desarrollo sostenible. Sin embargo, bueno, se ha retrocedido en muchos ODS o nos hemos estancado en algunas metas de desarrollo y que no se van a lograr, ya lo dijo la CEPAL también en algún momento. Y en el cambio climático, bueno, estamos en el círculo vicioso entre la deuda y el pago de los daños y desastres por los fenómenos meteorológicos. Entonces nos dicen, bueno, para atender todos estos problemas tenemos que recurrir al sector privado. Y ahí viene la primera preocupación, porque siempre el sector privado es hablar de negocios, hablar de ganancias, y nos dicen que no hay plata y por eso hay que traer al sector privado. Sin embargo, yo diría que si hay plata, el dinero está ahí, hay miles de millones de dólares que se van en combustibles fósiles, en armamentos, se van en fraude tributario, flujos financieros ilícitos, beneficios tributarios para sectores que no necesitan, y así, o sea, hay dinero que está escondido en paraísos fiscales. Entonces, todo esto, digamos, puede darnos una idea de que la plata está ahí, pero falta voluntad para redirigirla, ¿no? Entonces, en ese sentido, cuando hablamos de transición justa, desde la sociedad civil pensamos de que hay que tomar en cuenta elementos, ¿no? que no hay que repetir, de lo que ya hemos vivido, lo que seguimos viviendo y que aparentemente se quiere seguir reforzando. Es principalmente que no podemos seguir hablando de transición justa cuando hay que seguir extrayendo recursos, como sea, para generar ganancias de unos pocos y más bien atentar contra los derechos de comunidades, por ejemplo, que siguen siendo afectadas, ¿no? Porque de nada sirve que dejes de producir minerales o combustibles fósiles si luego con el litio o con el hidrógeno verde vas a seguir impactando no solo en las poblaciones, sino también en el ambiente. Entonces, tiene que haber un cambio ahí de chip, tiene que haber un cambio en el sistema financiero y económico para salir de ese entrampamiento. Y bueno, en la siguiente puedo comentar algunas cosas más. Gracias.
Thank you. That was very interesting. So the money is there, but the lack of will to direct it into the places where it is needed. This is what I heard you say. And also the question of debt. So this something we're not talking about yet, but debt is the elephant in the room, isn't it? What are the funds used for? And that's why it's so important that the public banks that can offer concessional loans, this is where the concessional loans come from, as public banks, isn't it? But again, yes, we'll have a discussion about what are these implications for debt also for many countries. It's contingent problems that weren't anticipated. I turn now to Karina Valverde Salas, who is here from the Banco Popular of Development of Costa Rica, and been doing a lot of work on public banks and public water, so public services. Karina, I know that your concern is very much about human rights, and how can public banks guarantee human rights? What is the role of public banks with human rights? I leave that to you. Thank you.
Muchas gracias. Yo, bueno, voy a hablar en español. Y muchas gracias por la invitación. Pienso que la exposición que acaba de hacer Rodolfo me generó como dos preguntas y que están vinculadas con el tema de derechos humanos, o si es mucho pedirle a un banco público que pueda o que sea garante de los derechos humanos. Y entonces, en ese sentido, ¿qué se espera de la sociedad civil o qué espera la sociedad civil de los bancos públicos? Y si hablamos de que esa sociedad civil está vinculada al tema de derechos humanos. Y entonces, si un banco, para hablar de un banco público, atendería estas necesidades de los derechos humanos desde el análisis de riesgo. Y hablo del tema del riesgo porque en mi experiencia de trabajar en el banco, cuando se plantean necesidades que están vinculadas con derechos humanos, y ahí también podemos hacer el enlace entre los derechos humanos y los SDGs, ¿verdad? Que muchos de estos SDGs están vinculados a derechos humanos. Entonces, cuando se plantean estas necesidades, es común que las personas, los profesionales que diseñan instrumentos financieros, den una respuesta de hay que hacer análisis de riesgos y el tema de los derechos humanos es un tema de alto riesgo, ¿verdad? Digamos, para que sean atendidos por los bancos públicos. Sin embargo, ¿qué es lo que quería, digamos, después de esta pequeñita introducción, que quería ejemplificar esto con la experiencia de investigación que realizamos, empezamos el año pasado, la terminamos este año, con un estudio de caso para hablar de agua y bancos públicos. Y el caso que es para Costa Rica es el Banco Popular y de Desarrollo Comunal, y el financiamiento que este banco, que es un banco público, el financiamiento que este banco da a organizaciones locales que administran el acceso a agua potable. Se supone que también deben proveer saneamiento, pero en las capacidades instaladas solo les alcanza para ofrecer agua potable, en comunidades rurales especialmente. Y bueno, entonces el Banco Popular, a través de financiamiento, digamos, diferenciado, ofrece este apoyo para optimizar la gestión que estas organizaciones sociales hacen en sus comunidades. Y ahí es donde a través de la investigación se puede establecer que sí, que un banco público puede ser garante de los derechos humanos a través del fortalecimiento de opciones de financiamiento para que esto sea posible. Pero lo interesante es que no necesariamente los bancos públicos quizás sean conscientes de esto que están haciendo, de que a través del financiamiento pueden aportar, digamos, al cumplimiento de derechos humanos, en este caso que sería el acceso al agua potable, que sería el derecho humano que se está atendiendo. Y bueno, a pesar de esto, se considera, y a pesar de que sí existe financiamiento para estas organizaciones, Se considera que es un financiamiento de alto riesgo, entonces se promueve, pero siempre con un poco se contiene un poco porque el argumento es que son financiamientos de alto riesgo. Entonces, pareciera, o podríamos decir que aparece una tensión entre el riesgo, los derechos humanos y los bancos públicos de desarrollo, incluso del capital privado. Entonces, lo que dejo aquí es cómo poder pensar en esta tensión que hay entre el riesgo, derechos humanos y bancos públicos de desarrollo.
Thank you. As you said, you were going to raise questions. So very, very interesting. Thank you so much. The questions of these high risks that are involved, also the high risk of doing nothing, which is something that everyone is, one of the reasons we're in the room talking about green transition. And so thank you, Karina. I want to move to our next speaker, Antonio Silveira, who is the manager of physical infrastructure and digital transformation in the CAF, the Latin American Development Bank. So, Antonio, from what you've heard in the room, how do you feel that your bank, with its infrastructure transformation mandate, what are you hearing from the role of public banks, and what is your mandate and your ability to fulfill that?
Thank you, Diana, for the question. It's a tough one, and I would like to thank to Mr. Ivan to show to all the audience somehow my age. How old am I? But from the point of view of a multilateral, especially a multilateral that doesn't have this separation between donors and borrowers, that's like CAF operates, I think the main advantage to be near the public banks that can be public development banks, public commercial banks, because as Mr. Ocampo told us, here in Colombia, there are 4 different public banks with different targets. In Brazil, where I came from, there are multiple public banks at federal level, and there are some at state level, mainly development banks. But for a multilateral, I think these banks in all the countries that we operate here, and I'm talking here about Brazil, Colombia, Mexico, Chile, etc., they're an excellent conduit for the purpose of impact for a multilateral, especially CAF that right now is presenting herself as the green bank for the region. Having close relation with banks that have in their board governments that are responsible for the pledges at Paris Agreement, for monitoring the SDGs, this is a quite good way to reach out where directly the multilaterals cannot go. Example, in Brazil, we cannot go in cities below 80,000 inhabitants, something like this. As to say, we cannot go to the very poorest areas. So going to public banks is a very good way. But not only for credit for business. It helps to enhance the convening power. And IFC has done it long before with the Equator Principles that apply to banking system in general, but having public banks a very important agent in each country. From our side right now, we are trying to step up a regional voluntary carbon market. And our main counterparts in the older region are public banks. So this is a role that's quite important. I myself, in my past life, I've chaired the boards of 2 big public banks in Brazil. Both of them were like hybrid banks. They had a commercial branch, but have not developed, but was a governmental branch that applied public policy on some areas. One of this was Caixa Econômica Federal, that has a close contact with municipalities, and oops, time's up. And the other one was Banco do Nordeste, that rules the regional policy. And just to end up, a little provocation to Thomas and Johannes, a part of society and shareholders, I think one can add the culture of local banking system into the equation of how this, the culture of the local banking system on how the public banks operate. They have a lot of influence on that. Thank you. Happy to, for the question.
Thank you, thank you. So what you've said is linking with some of the other speakers about the role of the network of many other public banks in the system, and how you are, as you said, you're working with other development banks, you're working with maybe other commercial banks, and so it's not just one bank, it's a whole ecosystem of banks. And so that's very important, I think, for discussing, you know, who is doing what and what is their particular role in that whole landscape. Thank you. So I'm turning now to our next speaker, who in fact is representing the whole region of the development banks here. We have Romy Calderon, the head of economic studies from ALIDE, the Latin American Association of Financial Institutions for Development. Romy, I lead to you.
Muchas gracias. En las presentaciones que se han ido dando han habido muchos conceptos y cosas que tienen que ver con lo que vemos diariamente. Y entonces yo quiero enfatizar en algunas cosas. Primero, que cuando uno hace un análisis de lo que es la banca de desarrollo en América Latina es muy distinta a lo que es en Europa. Eso hay que tenerlo presente. Por eso cuando hagan el estudio de esos detalles que hablaba de la cultura y todo eso, esos aspectos son importantes. Segundo, que los bancos de desarrollo tienen un mandato, y esos mandatos son muy claros porque los bancos de desarrollo no se crean por voluntad de personas, sino se crean por una ley de los congresos. Ahí está indicado qué es lo que deben hacer. No pueden salirse de eso, porque por muy buenas cosas que estés haciendo, el funcionario que hace eso se puede ir a la cárcel por haber hecho algo bueno, pero que no esté en la ley, ¿no? O sea, son cosas un poco extrañas que pasan, ¿no? Otro aspecto que tiene que ver es que en América Latina somos un poquito extraños en cierto aspecto, que a veces da un poco de risa, porque la regulación, que es un tema que no se ha tocado acá, a los bancos de desarrollo a veces se les aplica una regulación mucho más estricta. Cuando tú preguntas por qué, dicen, bueno, porque es un banco público, ¿no? Entonces hay una desconfianza. Entonces, ¿cómo hacer para que generes confianza en la gestión de esa organización? Hay algunas cosas que se están haciendo. Brasil tiene cosas interesantes a la hora que nombran los ejecutivos, algunos otros países también, porque lo hacen a través de concursos públicos. Hay algunas responsabilidades. Se está mejorando mucho en el tema de la gobernanza. Luego también hay otro aspecto que tiene que ver con lo que es la naturaleza distinta de las instituciones financieras de desarrollo. Cuando uno mira la banca comercial, casi todos tienen un formato parecido. Si uno quiere analizar la parte financiera, los indicadores son los mismos, haces tu plantilla, comparas uno con otro y listo. Los bancos de desarrollo no es así. Tienes un banco de desarrollo que es primer piso, otro segundo piso, uno que capta, otro que no capta, uno que emite, otro que no emite, ¿no? Uno que puede recibir fondos de cooperación, otro que no puede. En fin, hay unos que tienen subvenciones, otros que no lo tienen. Hay otros que están solamente enfocados en el sector agrícola, otros que están enfocados en comercio exterior, en infraestructura. Entonces, es muy difícil hacerlo. Hay que estudiar, yo diría, caso por caso, detalle por detalle. Y sí, una cosa que quiero enfatizar es lo que se habló. Por allí alguien lo dijo, creo que tú lo dijiste, Antonio, o lo dijo Dayana, ecosistema de banca de desarrollo. Yo siempre cuando miro y doy clases de banca de desarrollo, yo hablo de los sistemas de banca de desarrollo por países, pero ni yo mismo me lo creo, porque creo que habrán 3 o 4 países que tienen un sistema de financiamiento para el desarrollo y el resto no lo tiene. Lo que tiene son instituciones dispersas. Entonces, eso hay que darle una forma mucho más coherente. Además, hay que hacer lo que sea funcional con el resto de instituciones, porque, por ejemplo, tenemos países donde tenemos banco de desarrollo, tenemos entidades financieras comerciales privadas, pero también tenemos una gama de entidades financieras no bancarias que te permiten bajar a segmentos muy bajos, y hay otros países que no tienen eso. Entonces, ahí hay particularidades que hacen que esos ecosistemas también sean diferentes. Ahí yo lo dejo porque me pasa el tiempo.
Thank you. Gosh, everyone is being so good with the timekeeping. I'm very impressed. Thank you, Romy. That very interesting, and particularly picking up on what you've said, that we need more information. We need more studies and research, because there's actually not very much information about all of the differences between the banks and the way that they interact. And we do have now this wonderful database that's been produced by speakers who are this afternoon after us presenting that, so I hope you'll go. But yes, as you've raised the point, there's a huge amount of research that still needs to be done on how to improve understanding about development banks, and that will then help them fulfill a better role. Let me turn to our next speaker, who is Ulrich Volz, who some of you will know, a professor of Professor of Economics from the Center of Sustainable Finance and SOAS. So, Uli, if you can please tell us, what do you see after this discussion now, and in light of your own research, what is the role of public banks in terms of mobilizing capital?
Yeah, well, I mean, of course, there's multiple roles, but when it comes to mobilizing private capital, I think they have a really, really important one. And let me emphasize very much that I believe that private capital has to play a critical role, but we have also to be sober and look at the empirical evidence. And so for the time being, the billions to trillions agenda, blended finance has not been overly successful. So there are a lot of kind of nice examples of project-based de-risking, but it hasn't worked at scale. And so it's very transaction heavy, and so we need to have, I think, a much larger role of public development banks doing direct financing, direct lending to government, but also project financing. And there are a lot of public goods that need to get financed to advance the SDGs, to support a just transition, and these will not generate the cash flows that private investors require. Especially international investors, when you also take into account exchange risk, country risk, and so on. So as institutions with a public mandate, public development banks, both international ones and also national ones, are very well equipped to finance projects that generate the positive externalities and that have high enough returns to be profitable, but that do not satisfy the return demands from private investors. And very importantly, public development banks, they can really act as vehicles to attract and absorb a lot of private capital. Stephanie also referred to that. And they can act as aggregators. So the kind of most straightforward way is absorbing a lot of private capital by issuing bonds and then on lend at low rates. And the MDBs, of course, have been doing that for a long time, but they need to be doing that at a much larger scale. So basically issue AAA rated bonds. There is a huge demand for these safe assets and then on lend at cheap rates. That's the MDBs, but also the NDBs, the National Development Banks, they can also play a very important role in absorbing more private capital, and in particular also mobilizing domestic savings. Because at the moment we have the very perverse situation that we see a lot of capital exports from developing countries, from emerging countries, to the financial centers of the rich countries. Yeah? We'll be coming out with a study in a month or two where we show that actually we have around $1 trillion of net capital outflows from the developing world. And this is all money that should be, or much of it, should be invested in local investments. And so national development banks can play a really important role in by absorbing more of that local savings, and multilateral institutions, international development finance institutions can play a critical role in helping them. Because one issue, unlike KfW, which is backed by a AAA rated government, most national development banks don't have this privilege, which also means that their refinancing costs are very different. And they can't issue safe assets the same way that, for example, KfW can, or the World Bank, or the other NDBs can. Multilateral development banks, the KfWs of the world with a strong rating, they can support national development banks not only in capacity building, in building strong corporate governance, but also in helping them to obtain cheaper refinancing. And that is important also because then these national development banks can create safe assets, which will be attractive also for domestic savers. And as I said before, instead of having huge capital outflows, we need to have actually more capital inflows, but also be much better at mobilizing domestic savings. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Uli. That's really interesting. You're talking about scaling up in the way that's needed, but also funds going to where they're needed, which is a different vision. We're strengthening the public banks. We're not thinking of them being just supporting the private capital in a different way. So very important. Thank you. I turn quickly to Esteban Perez from UN ECLAC, another expert on the region, and he will be our last speaker. Then we'll have questions from the floor. So thank you very much, Esteban.
Thank you very much for the invitation. A just transition certainly needs scale, but it also needs an analysis of the composition of the financial landscape. We need a more granular analysis. We know that not all development banks have the same lending capacity and access to the same financing conditions. Climate change in Latin America is undertaken mainly by multilateral banks and sub-regional development banks. For 2020, 85% of the investment was done by these banks, very little by national development banks. And this is not a question of mandate, it's a question of capacity. Some banks, national development banks, except for maybe the Benedes and maybe 2 or 3 other banks, have limited access to low-cost sources of finance and insufficient long-term capital. They don't have the capacity for large-scale projects that require a strong investment of initial capital or that have long gestation periods. They lack experience, technical capacity, and also appetite for risk because they lack the evaluation capacity of risk. If one takes a look at balance sheets of different development banks in Latin America, we know, for example, that the IDB has set a target of 35% of its portfolio for climate investment. I think CAF has set an even higher standard in terms of its composition. But some national development banks barely have sometimes 1% of their portfolio to finance green investment. So we need to focus more on national development banks and how to improve their integration, define their role, and how to build really a development back network which is needed for just transition. Are we going to have our development banks, national development banks have more capital, or are we thinking about a division of roles? And this within a context where, as Romy pointed out, the national development banks in Latin America are highly heterogeneous. We have about 105 national development financial institutions with a wide dispersion in terms of financial indicators. There's no blueprint model. What we know, and this is common, is that there are 78% of those banks that are first-tier banks. So what we're trying to push in ECLAC, first of all, is trying to learn to articulate communication among national development banks so that we can extract and identify best practices through knowledge platforms and comparable data. Innovation is necessary, but innovation does not occur in a vacuum. It occurs by design, and it has to occur within an ecosystem beyond a financial ecosystem. Guarantees, for example, require certain institutional framework, governance, operations and administration, financial relationships, plus certain collective capacities. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Esteban. So it's a very complex situation which we need to have better understanding about many of these soft elements as well as the scale of capital. Yeah, they're very interesting. Thank you. So I think we have 15 minutes now where we can have some discussion from the floor. Please put your hand up, and if you have a question you want to direct to a speaker in particular, please do so. We do have people with microphone who will come around. I think let's take 2 or 3 questions first, and then we answer them, in a clump. And please, may we ask if you can make the question brief, because I see quite a few hands. So thank you. And also say who you are.
Hello, I'm Miriam Garcia from CDP Latin America. Talking about comparable data, I would like to know, how do you see the role of public banks in integrating climate disclosure, such as ISSB or TNFD? And especially for Brazil, how do you see the role of Brazil in supporting the agenda of climate disclosure during the G20 presidency?
Can we just take a few questions? There's one in the front here. There's one in the back.
Thank you. There's a question for Mr. Silveira. Esteban Perez was saying about the strong drive of CAF to become a green bank. How does that translate within the policies of the bank? What do they do to become green?
Gracias. Mi nombre es Gonzalo Rosa, coordinador de la de Gobernabilidad Global de FUNDEPS, Fundación por el Desarrollo de Políticas Sustentables de Córdoba, Argentina. Es un comentario con una pregunta general que pueden responder. Veo en este espacio de Finanzas en Común y lo que venimos trabajando hace tiempo desde sociedad civil en relación a bancos multilaterales, que, bueno, los bancos se están posicionando, los bancos de desarrollo se están posicionando hace tiempo como, y lo hemos escuchado mencionar mucho, actores clave en este proceso de financiamiento para la transición energética y demás. Y creo que no han hecho, o no veo que se haya hecho una autocrítica profunda desde los bancos multilaterales de cuál ha sido el rol que han venido implementando hasta el momento, cómo ha sido la forma que han venido operando para promover el desarrollo. Y creo que para poder posicionarse de una manera efectiva en este momento histórico en el que estamos y poder posicionarse como un actor clave para la transición energética, esa autocrítica y ese análisis de lecciones aprendidas y demás debe estar presente. Creo que con las prácticas que ha venido implementando hasta ahora los bancos multilaterales, va a ser imposible llevar adelante los objetivos que se plantean en términos de transición energética, en términos de alcanzar los objetivos de desarrollo sostenible. Y hace falta un cambio profundo en la forma de operar de los bancos. No veo que haya, sí veo que hay más financiamiento, que se buscan alternativas para alcanzar determinados objetivos con más dinero, apalancar el financiamiento privado y demás, pero no veo que haya un cambio o por lo menos un análisis desde los bancos en la forma en que han venido operando hasta ahora. Creo que las alternativas que están planteando son las mismas que se vienen planteando desde hace años. Entonces, mi pregunta es, ¿creen que con el modelo de desarrollo que han venido implementándolos o promoviendo los bancos multilaterales van a lograr conseguir los objetivos que se plantean desde hace tiempo desde diferentes ámbitos? Yo no lo creo así, pero me gustaría escuchar las reacciones desde los representantes de bancos. Gracias.
Thank you. So we have 3 great questions. Who would like to volunteer first? We have questions of the MDBs at the table. Would you like to start? Oh, one more question. I'm so sorry, I didn't see you standing there.
Buenas tardes, mi nombre es Betina Cruz Velázquez. Soy una mujer originaria de México, del sur de México, Vinizá. Y pues a mí me gustaría saber cómo los bancos pueden ver que se cumplan sus objetivos, esos ODS que dicen por lo que están buscando toda la financiación en los territorios, en nuestros territorios, y dónde llegan sin que los pueblos o nosotros sepamos. No estamos, hablan también de que es para la transición, pero es una transición que para nosotros no ha sido una transición justa, sino es una transición que nos ha empobrecido más, porque beneficia a algunos y a todos los demás les quita las tierras de donde podemos vivir. Entonces, ¿cómo es posible que se puedan llegar a esos objetivos de desarrollo sostenible con ese tipo de prácticas de los grandes inversionistas? En mi territorio tenemos 3,000 aerogeneradores instalados en más de 50,000 hectáreas que nos arrebataron, y además ese dinero no se va a las bolsas de la gente de la región. Es uno de los lugares con mucho más violencia y con más índice de empobrecimiento desde que llegaron las eólicas, es en el istmo de Tehuantepec. Y ahí están precisamente muchas empresas de inversión europea, hay muchas empresas españolas, italianas, francesas. Entonces, pues, y además un punto es de que aquí lo que están tratando es supuestamente la transición energética para el bienestar común. Pues no pensamos que sea el bienestar común, es para el bienestar de algunos cuantos que son los inversores, y que además a nosotros no nos ha traído nada, ¿no? Entonces, ¿cuál es el bienestar que se persigue? ¿El bienestar para qué? ¿El bienestar para quién? ¿Para dónde va esta transición energética? Que solamente es el cambio de la energía fósil porque se está agotando hacia otros modelos que los han pintado de verde. Esa es nuestra opinión, porque eso es lo que estamos viviendo en los territorios. Gracias.
Thank you. Thank you very much. A really interesting and important question. I look at my colleagues who would like to start first with answers. We have 4 important questions. Climate disclosure, what is the implications of really treating that seriously? What is CAF doing to be green? I think it's clear who that question's for. The question about, if we just do the same old story, how are things be any different from the past? We obviously want development banks to be engaged in a highly positive way. And the 4th question was, is this actually a just and sustainable process of transition or not? So I look at my colleagues, no one's jumping yet. Johannes, you're making a strong move.
Yeah, I would leave Antonia first. That's how I understood it, but fine. I feel incompetent to answer question 1 or 2. I feel a little competent, and just for the sake of time, to answer question 3, in a sense, look at the plenary for tomorrow. Aligning public and private finance with the SDGs will be a plenary tomorrow afternoon at 2 o'clock. I think that may provide some answers what public and multilateral development banks can help to support SDGs. Very finally, and then there may be competent speakers on the other questions, I would like to also respond to a 5th question that came from the panel from you on human rights. What do we do on human rights? Well, I'm at least glad to say that we as the Council of Europe Development Bank, yes, this is one of our core natural focuses. The Council of Europe as our parent organization is basically a value-driven organization, promoting democracy, rule of law, and human rights. Now, how does that concretely translate? We, as a bank, also finance prisons. Not a very sexy topic, but if you're interested in the topic, you can look at what the Council of Europe produces annually on the situation of prisons in its member states. Well, it doesn't cover South America and North America. It covers Europe. It covers its member states, and it's quite critical on the situation of prisons in many states. And you would find countries criticized in that report that you don't want to see there. Anyhow, we are financing prisons, and when we are asked by a member state to finance a prison in XYZ region, they are asking us to do that, knowing that the standards of that prison will not be the standards, will be the standards of the Council of Europe, high standards. And there we close the loop to, yes, it is a concrete example of human rights being met through financing of a multilateral development such as us. Thank you.
Thank you. Let's hear from the CAF.
Well,
Thank you.
yeah, I had a direct question. So just to be specific, Esteban mentioned our target is to have 40% of the approvals to 2026 in green finance. This is the commitment of CAF. And thank you very much for your question. It's a challenging one. Of course, how this commitment reflects on our processes. One, on the internal processes, we are already carbon neutral in terms of the internal functioning of CAF, but I think the question is not aiming this target. On energy transition, let me start with it. Our framework for energy transition includes mid and downstream for natural gas, because we understand that this is a vector for contribute to cleaning up the energy matrices on the region. A part of it can be a very useful source of income for the governments for social policies. So yes, we are in the mid and downstream gas business. The other character of CAF is that as we don't have donor countries, we don't have on our board the G7 or the US to write down specific guidelines to show the truth to the clients. So we rely a lot on country systems. We have some basic, very general guidelines. In terms of environmental safeguards, we have not only a clear approach, but we have a team that revises all the environmental risks and promotes the agenda for the Green Bank. But day by day, we rely on country systems. And how to convince the countries to demand green projects. This is a matter of advocacy and in the board meetings, and then I have to join with Johannes. The board means a lot. We have to convince, because there are finance and planning ministers, we have to convince them that CAF, they approved a strategy to CAF to move this way. Then, by the same token, the finance from CAF has to be on that way. It's not always a linear equation, but we're going for it. Thanks.
Thank you. Very interesting. Do I have any other volunteers for the questions? I think, yes, one, Ivan. And then we'll do a quick tour de table very quickly. The next presentation doesn't start until after 5 o'clock, so we can, I think, quickly do one very brief comment from each of the speakers to finish.
Thanks, Diana. Well, specifically on disclosure in our agenda in G20, and somehow touching on some of the other questions too. Yes, disclosure will continue to be in the agenda. In fact, a Sustainable Finance Working Group, we have been dealing with that. But here's something that we all know, but it needs to be explicit. That is, we need data, we need information, and we need indicators in order to assess what we're doing, where we're moving. But we all know that indicators are not neutral. And in that sense, there is a whole agenda going on internationally when it comes to what is not green, all the taxonomies and things like that we're doing nationally. Also, again, part of our plan is also to have our national taxonomy, sustainable taxonomy, so getting social and climate aspects together. We're starting to flex the muscles, and we're going to use the G20 presidency in that sense. That is, we need to have a good discussion on disclosure, but we really need to get to know the data and the interests behind the data and indicators that we're dealing with. It is crucial to create markets in many aspects. It is crucial to push for a real change in the economy. But again, we need just to be a little bit careful not to go too quickly and not to see what we can quite clearly see up to now. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll very quickly then address the questions that haven't been touched on yet. So first of all, the question from Mexico about the immediate impact on the communities that are affected very negatively by what is desired as an energy policy elsewhere. It's absolutely essential that there will be support for communities that are negatively impacted. And in fact, this is going to happen everywhere through the transition process. Every single move that we make to, for example, reduce dependence on fossil fuel, there will be people who are extremely negatively impacted. If the transition is going to occur and go to a transformation, or to be sustainable, it has to be just, and that's something we really need to appreciate. In the South African case with the Just Energy Transition Program, they had budgeted for a big expenditure to be put on social support, and they didn't get the money for that, and it's a big problem. And so that's one example of how these packages need to be done in the way that really does consider all of those issues. The other question about self-criticism, will there be proper self-criticism of banks so that they can fulfill the role in the way that is needed for this massive investment push that's coming up? Well, I think one of the things that's also worth looking at is that borrowers have more choices than they used to. There are now trillions of dollars available in other sources, and they will potentially look elsewhere if they feel that the needs are not being met in the banks. One of the terribly important to have the banks that are doing this correctly and to meet the needs of people, because for some borrowers, it's the only source that they will get, and it's the main source of concessional lending, but it's not the only source. And we have seen new banks rise in the last few years, particularly South-South banks, that are an explicit search for a different model, with a different mandate and a different governance. And the other thing that I think is very interesting is that MDBs are now quite small compared to bilateral capital flows. And these bilateral flows do not have any of the benefits of a transparent, democratic bank that all countries can borrow from. So I think this is quite a concern for moving forward. So I just wanted to touch that point. So now I think we've answered the questions. Perhaps if every member of the table, and let's just maybe we start at one end and just go round, because I'm too tired to think who went last and first. So we just go round the table. Briefly, if just your last word to us, please. Thank you.
No, just an obvious thing. What we as a global society have failed to improve in terms of avoiding climate change is already unfolding and is having its effect, and it will continue to have its effect, and very likely so even worse. What we strongly believe, and I've seen that the vulnerable people are the most affected by that, and therefore we try to work on that belief in implementing in each and every project the understanding that social inclusion needs to go hand in hand with climate action. Thank you.
Pienso que lo que me queda agregar, y después de escuchar la intervención de la señora mexicana, que no recuerdo el nombre, perdón, y es que me parece que todavía hace falta hacerse la pregunta, porque se ha dicho, o lo que escuché hoy durante la mañana, es que puede haber este soporte del capital, de los bancos públicos de desarrollo a capital privado, pero quizás todavía hace falta hacernos la pregunta de cuál es el propósito del capital privado y cuál es el propósito del capital público, y si estos entran en contradicción, que yo creo que sí, pero entonces si esa contradicción en la que entran estos propósitos se atiende cuando se piensan instrumentos financieros, accesibilidad, igualdad, inclusión, etcétera.
Okay.
So we just go around. Yeah.
Yeah, very quickly, I would like to echo one point that Romy mentioned. If we want to look to the public banks and their role, you have to take into account the specificities of the regions and most of the time the countries. For example, in Brazil, BNDES, that is the development bank, is regulated by the central bank. So it has basic rules. And when you look into the allocation of capital, it can be surprising from the point of view of a regulated private bank, but it's part of the structure. So a message for this type of study is take into account the differences, because they will explain a lot in terms of the results, a part of everything that can be compared, but take this into account. Thanks.
Excuse me, if I can just interrupt. I just got a text message from Jose Antonio, who has to leave very briefly. So I just let him. Jose, are you there? Can you put Jose on? He has to leave very shortly, so we'll just try and get his comment before we go around the table. No. Okay. While we're trying to get Jose Antonio on, Agnes, please, if you could have your moment, because I don't want to keep the room.
Okay, thank you. So the message I want us all to go home with is that public development banks, they do have the potential, and they can have a pioneering opportunity to advance gender equality as a matter of public purpose. But to fulfill this commitment, what do they need? They need to ensure that gender equality is fostered in a manner that is transformative. And by transformative, I mean they need to look at the root causes of gender inequality. They need to look at the systems that result in perpetuating these gender inequalities. So if they can really work on doing that and ensuring that gender mainstreaming is transformative, I think they really can do a good job in terms of advocating for gender equality. It's important to know that in terms of achieving this important goal, the SDG 5, which is also often usually overlooked, and yet it is really critical, it is important for public development banks to also understand the concepts of this gender equality, what it means. Because what we are finding is that there is this tendency to misunderstand what gender is. There is a tendency to think it's about women's issues, but it's not about women's issues. It's not just about women's experiences. It is about the experiences of men, women, boys, girls. So it is really, really a critical area to really look into. And I think the reason they usually overlook it is because they lack understanding of what it really is and the impact it could really have if they gave it attention. So I would also like to say that it is important for the public development banks to mainstream gender effectively in their policies and operational frameworks, and this includes resource mobilization strategies, applying financial instruments, and also deploying financial resources, targeting initiatives that have potential to create quality green jobs as well for both men and women, such, for example, in areas such as renewable energy, healthcare, education. And this needs to be done, like I said, in a manner that is transformative. And I also want to leave you with a message that without challenging the underlying causes of gender inequality through transformative approach, approach, gender equality will remain to be out of reach. You do know we've been talking about gender equality since 1945. That is so long, and to this day we are still talking about gender equality and gender inequalities. So we need to really examine our approaches and those processes, and I think public development banks have an opportunity here to really drive this process. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Agnes. Jose Antonio, please, your brief final comments.
Yeah, thank you very much, Diana. It has been very nice participating, and I share most of what has been said today. But let me actually just make one emphasize in relation to the multilateral development banks. They need to have a good relation between the multilateral and the national development banks. The national development, the multilateral should support development banks in the several functions that have been mentioned today. For example, referring to the three I mentioned in the beginning, which is financial inclusion, promoting innovation and structural change, and the green economy. Those are activities in which all the multilateral development banks should be involved. And there is a significant benefit from working together with the national development banks. And thank you. Sorry, I have to leave now, but thank you. It has been a great pleasure participating.
Thank you, Jose Antonio. Ivan.
Thank you. Well, I'll get this point on the multilateral development banks, and really more than a final thoughts. I'd just like to call and to make a call here, really, so that we can get the best out of the Brazilian G20 presidency. We really want to engage a lot more with the banks themselves. So there is a whole agenda we want to do with the multilateral development banks in order to deal with the IFA working group agenda. There is a lot to be done when it comes to operational review, and also somehow connecting operational review with strategic agendas for the multilateral development banks, for example. We also want to connect a lot more even to the private sector itself. In fact, for example, in the Sustainable Finance Working Group, the key objective is to scale up a private capital mobilization for sustainable projects, but we end up not really bringing them and hearing what are the problems, where do they see that we could connect multilateral banks, development banks, green funds, and the agenda of the private sector. So in order to do so, we're going to need ideas, so ideas are really welcome. There are plenty of opportunities for thinking about side events that could really feed the discussions within the G20 on some of the agendas on the banks and other stakeholders. So that's a call, and that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, David.
So very quickly, I think
we really have to be fast now. We've
counted at least 10 different very important targets we should reach as public banks. Now, if we open up to the audience, I guess we would have 20 or 30 goals. So my last statement, let's be ambitious but humble. Yeah, I think as a tip for our proposal for next panel, maybe we have to discuss more on the limitation of what public banks can do. Otherwise, we create false expectations. Thank you very much.
Thank you. That's very good. Ambitious but humble. I think those are very important words. I think we've reached our limit, 4:58. I know we're supposed to be out of this room by now. So, fellows, are you all right if we don't? I don't want to try our audience too much. I want to say thank you very much, everybody. This has really been wonderful. I hope it's not the first. I hope it's not the last. It's maybe the first of our conversations, but not the last. And we look forward to engaging with you. Thank you very much.